Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Interact podcast. My name is Josh Hainum. I'm the co founder and CEO at Interact. Today, I am joined by Professor Yi Li, who is from UC Riverside, an associate professor of management there. Yi has some really interesting research on behavioral science and how people make decisions that caught my attention and I thought was super fascinating. So I wanted to have him on to talk about it. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Josh. A pleasure to be here.
Yeah. So I want to start off with like your personal interest in studying behavioral science and like how people make decisions. Like it's a niche and I think it's growing in popularity, but when you started, 15, 20 years ago, probably not as popular, or maybe it was to you. Why is this so interesting to you? What's the personal curiosity?
Yeah, it's funny that you call it a niche. I do think that it's grown quite a bit. When I started on this whole enterprise, what I was just interested in is understanding human beings. Growing up, I wasn't the most socially adept child. I frankly made a lot of mistakes. I felt like I didn't have a good understanding of how other people thought. And so I was really interested in psychology. However, I ended up at the California Institute of Technology, Caltech, where they do not have a psychology major. The closest thing that they had was economics. And it turns out economics is a good fit as well, because economics is also about the study of human behavior and with math. And I'm also pretty good at math. I thought this was great. And there was this guy there, Colin Kammerer, who's one of the world's experts at something called behavioral game theory. And I ended up doing some research with him. I thought this is the coolest thing ever. And I wanted to get a PhD like his. Now, that meant going to the University of Chicago, where there's something called the Center for Decision Research. But at the time, I thought I was trying to be a behavioral economist. When I got there, I realized there aren't people doing behavioral economics here other than Richard Thaler, who you may know as the Nobel Prize winning author of the book Nudge. Everyone else was doing just basic decision making research. And I realized, hey, that's also pretty interesting. And so, to be honest, I sort of fell backwards into it. But now that I've been working on it for almost 20 years, it's kind of weird to say that. It's the sort of thing where I can't imagine doing anything else. It's really such a broad field in terms of how far I can go in understanding lots of different questions, even though, as you say, it's somewhat niche in terms of most people don't think about decision making as a field of study.
Right, but it affects everything, literally. I mean, how you make decisions and what you decide to do with your time and your money and your relationships and all those things impacts your whole life. It's like it's constantly there. So something that I was thinking about as I was preparing is like, what are the things that have surprised you the most about how humans behave and how they make decisions, like as you've studied it for 20 years? Like what are the kind of highlights of, okay, this was not.
Well, the funny thing about doing research is that when you've worked on a project for a while, it stops being surprising. You start to actually second guess, is this even novel? Is this something that is counterintuitive enough to convince a journal editor that this is worth publishing? But from that perspective and stepping back, I think what's surprising to most people is that we think of ourselves as relatively rational beings. And what decades of research in behavioral science and psychology more broadly has discovered is that we are far from it. Yes, we're largely rational, but there's so many imperfections that it would be silly to say that we're fully rational.
Why do people think that they're rational?
Well, this is a really interesting topic, and there's lots of different ways to answer this. I'll answer in a way that I just taught my students in class on Wednesday, which is confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is this idea that when we look at the world, there's a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of information we don't know. And when we search for that information, or when we interpret information that's somewhat ambiguous, we tend to interpret it or search for it in a way that aligns with what we already know. So when we think of ourselves as, say, good drivers, nobody thinks about the times that they weren't a good driver. Those are times that you had an excuse, right? You were late for an interview. You were having a really bad day that morning. You think of all the times that you didn't get into an accident or that you didn't get a speeding ticket. And so the way we view ourselves is necessarily going to be in this sort of rosy colored, have rose tinted glasses.
Is there a way to undo that? Like to actually look at yourself more objectively?
It's not the sort of thing you want to do, actually. It turns out that having this positive self view is very good. And the types of folks who don't have it, we call them clinically depressed. Honestly, it's surprisingly the case that if you're overconfident, if you have an overly optimistic self view, you actually end up having a better mental health. You have a better way of approaching the world. I feel like maybe we're getting a little far afield from my research and more into my teaching. So maybe let me take a step back and talk about stuff I'm perhaps a little bit more expert in. So a lot of my research revolves around the role of time in decision making. And one of the things that I've found over and over is that what influences our decisions oftentimes isn't our view of the future, isn't some rational calculation, but rather something that's actually very temporary, something very contextual, something specific about this moment. And when you ask someone, well, did you consider this, that, or the other, a lot of times you'll find out that even for an incredibly important decision, they didn't. Even for incredibly important decisions, people end up considering only a very small portion of what a full-fledged decision-making process would probably want to look like. Even for something as complex as buying a car, which university should you go to? How should you approach a job interview? All of these sorts of things are incredibly important and incredibly complex. But due to the way that our brains are so adaptive to the current situation and also so good at conserving energy, we do what's simple.
Yeah, well, thanks for re-steering it because that's fascinating. So, what does simple mean then in your research?
Yeah, so take emotions. I've done a lot of work on the role of emotions in decision making, especially when it comes to how it impacts our decisions of choosing between things that benefit us now and things that benefit us in the future. So generally these have a trade-off in that if they benefit you in the future, it's going to come at some cost now, such as working out. Or if it benefits us now, it'll usually come at some cost in the future, such as you haven't saved enough for retirement, or you've spent decades smoking and now you have lung cancer. These sorts of decisions are thought of as, in the jargon, intertemporal choices, right? You're making choices between different points in time, costs and benefits at different points in time. And what I find is that your emotional state has a surprisingly large role in how patiently you approach these decisions. So take sadness. When we think of sadness, we think, well, this is the sort of thing that people experience in actually a lot of very important times when it comes to financial decisions. Right? You have a loved one pass away. What do you do with their house? What do you do in terms of the funeral? A lot of those choices are very large financial choices. And yet what we find in our research is that people who are currently experiencing sadness actually behave more impatiently, which could, as you can imagine, be kind of problematic.
And how does that actually impact their, like, I guess, their decision in that? Like, if you're acting more impatiently, what does that actually mean?
It entails choosing things that, for example, we know that people are very willing to pay a lot for funerals. And perhaps that's what they feel is valuable now. The large cost be damned. This is the thing that brings me the most joy now. And that's how people behave. Have you heard the term retail therapy? I think that also very, very much relates to sadness. When you feel sad, you go out there and you buy something to immediately make yourself feel better now.
Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. In terms of like the impact on, I guess, mitigating the happiness or the sadness, like, have you gone into that realm where it's like, does it actually help?
Well, I did actually receive quite a bit of press coverage when I published this paper in 2013. And reporters often asked, like, all right, so we should aim to be happier. We should try to strive to make decisions while happy. And there is actually a lot of research already showing that there are other issues with making decisions while happy. That's not my research. I'm not going to cover it here. But I'll point out that happiness isn't the only positive emotion, right? The opposite of happiness in many people's minds might be sadness. Sadness and happiness are opposites. But when it comes to the precise study of emotions, happiness is just one of many positive emotions. And when we ran a study where we manipulated people to be happier, that is, we showed them a funny video clip design that has been shown to make people happier. It didn't change their patience in these intertemporal financial choices. However, we also studied a second emotion, gratitude. And the interesting thing is gratitude is a social emotion which has the functionality of helping group cohesion. And part of it is when you feel grateful to someone, you want to reciprocate that gratitude. And what we had reason is that this is therefore naturally a forward-looking emotion. You're looking to what can you do for this person in the future? And what we found is that gratitude and not happiness does make people more patient when it comes to their financial decisions.
Mm.
And that, by the way, this
Gratitude.
was really surprising to us because I think this is the first time we had documented an emotion, a specific emotion, actually helping decision making. Because when you think about, say, like classic Greek philosophers, Stoicism, there's this very strong push to tamp down emotions. And this was some of the first evidence, I think, that was ever discovered in science of emotions actually benefiting decision making.
Yeah. And those books, the Epictetus and the Marcus Aurelius, right? Like it's all about just like don't feel anything. Like, don't just act as if you're already dead, basically, which is like
Yeah, be as much. They didn't have the concept of a robot back then, but be a robot and you'll make better decisions.
exactly. So that is really interesting that there is an emotion that you can lean into that does benefit decision making. Did anything else come out of that study that was noteworthy to you?
For that one, not so much, but I do know that other people have since done follow-up work on, say, the experience of awe and how that
Hmm.
can also be, because it's an expansive feeling, can also lead to some impacts, some of which are positive on decision making. But again, since it's not my own work, I hesitate to comment on it too much.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. You've mentioned a couple times like positive or negative or good or bad decision making. How is that defined in these studies?
So that's a $1 million question. And
Hmm.
one of the first things that I posed to my decision making class. And one of the things that pops out of research is something called outcome bias. When most people think about good decision making, they think, well, if your decision led to something good happening for you, that's a good decision. But in reality, there's a lot of uncertainty in the world. And if your outcomes are uncertain, then there's no way that you can control what happens at the end. So even if you make the highest expected value, the rational, optimal choice, you may well end up with bad luck, let's call it, and have a bad outcome. So what I try to teach my class is that you can only focus on the decision making process. And when it comes to these sort of financial decisions, that's going to be a function of your preferences, right? Everyone has a time preference. It is the case that money now is different from money later due to things like inflation, opportunity cost. And so you should discount the future in some ways. But the extent to which people discount is way too high. And so when we say for those studies that I talked about before, making better decisions, we mean more patient decisions. Now, of course, more patient isn't the right decision for everyone. Some people, if you're going to die next year, you shouldn't wait for an extra $100, right? If you have terminal cancer. But for most people, I think you can afford to be a little bit more patient to have a little bit more of a long-term perspective.
Something that pops in my head is like you say that people overweight the present or overweight what's more immediate. Is there like data on how, like to what extent people overweight something that's immediate?
That is a great question. Literature in economics says that the extent to which you should weigh the present differently from the future is essentially a function of how much can you borrow money at. So if I offer you a choice between $50 today versus $60 in a year, most people would say, well, that's only 10 extra dollars. I don't want to wait an extra year for $10. But if you think about the return on that 10 on that $50, that's a 20% return. That's an incredible investment. And if you could make that investment tenfold, a hundredfold, everyone should do it. And in fact, if you offer the same decision between 5,000 and 6,000, people will mostly choose 6,000 because then they'll say, for $1,000, I'll definitely wait. Now, to an economist, those are the same decision. Those should be the same decision because they both involve the same rate of return. And so if you were to ask most economists, your personal discount rate, they refer to this idea of how much you discount the future as a discount rate, your personal discount rate probably shouldn't be any higher than what you can borrow money at. So let's suppose that the APR on your cheapest credit card, the lowest APR on a credit card you have is 20%, then you should accept anything that has a 20% return on it or more. And otherwise, you should accept the more current thing. Now, when it comes to other non-financial decisions, it's a little bit harder to say because different people will have very different preference functions for how much they hate going to the gym now or hate eating their vegetables now and how much they really don't want to be overweight or how much they don't want to have insufficient savings in retirement.
Hmm. Yeah, so it's like variable depending on your own set of preferences in your life. I wanted to highlight the gratitude concept a little bit because that, I mean, I'm sure you feel this way. I feel this way. I feel like that word gets misused a lot. Like, what is the actual definition of that when you're like studying gratitude?
So I'm not sure if it's misused, but rather that gratitude is a bigger concept than the word itself seems to capture.
Mm,
So when I think of gratitude, it's the feeling that we have of having received something, whether it's from a person, whether it's from a situation, whether it's just being the benefactor, uh, beneficiary of good luck, as it were, in your life, right? So you can feel gratitude towards your parents. You can feel gratitude towards just being alive now and not 1,000 years ago. And actually, we try to do some follow up research where we try to disentangle these different types of gratitude. Is it gratitude towards a person, or is it just a gratefulness of your current situation, right? That whole idea of count your blessings. And what we found is surprisingly, all of these kind of lead to the same impact on your financial decisions in terms of how patient you are. And so even though there are these different types of gratitude, I think they might actually all end up leading you to the same route.
really interesting because I
Now,
would.
that's not published work, let me point out. So it's very hard to publish a null result. And so when you say these things were not found to be different, that's all you can say. You can never say they are the same. We just don't have
Oh,
evidence
right,
that they're different. And it's
right.
very hard to publish that.
Right. Yeah, because I guess there could be other things going on, right? That you can't rule out per se. You can't, it's like whatever that bias is where you can't just say, "Oh, because it's not this, it is this." That wouldn't work. But that's super interesting to me, like based on, all the work that I've done over the years to hear that, cuz like I think a lot of times people will try to posit like, oh, it needs to be this or it needs to be that. It needs to be about family or it needs to be about friends or it needs to be about money or whatever it is. So that's actually quite interesting to me to hear that. I wanted to highlight the time concept a little bit more. You had a piece on question asking, and I was wondering in terms of like asking questions, like not asking too many questions, not asking too few questions, and how that factors into like the amount of time that it takes somebody to answer those questions. What has like come up in there, because I'm fascinated with the idea of like how do you ask a good question, and I'm curious like what your research tells you about that, the question of how do you ask a good question.
Yeah, so I have definitely spent a lot of time thinking about this as a behavioral researcher. This is kind of like our set of tools that we use to answer questions in research. And so asking a good question or designing a good survey is a key part of doing behavioral science. And what we noticed in one of our studies, which had 20 questions that were these financial choices between a smaller amount of money now and a larger amount of money later, is that if you took the first 10 questions out of these 20 questions and used those answers, participants' answers to those questions to predict how well they save for retirement or whether they smoked or not, right? These real world intertemporal choices. What we found is that it did as well of a job, as good of a job of predicting those real world behaviors as if you included all 20 questions. And that was a little strange to us because it meant that this survey instrument, which had been published as a state of the art survey instrument in the year 2020 or something like that, or maybe 2018. So very recent in a top journal and by some of our co-authors, was asking too many questions. Because if you could get the same amount of information from 10 questions as from 20, what was the purpose of asking those next 10 questions? You paid extra time if you're paying for a participant's time, or at the very least, you wasted someone's time, you wasted someone's effort in answering these questions. And what we eventually realized is that when it comes to structured surveys. And what I mean by structured is you have a lot of questions that have kind of the same format. So again, with these intertemporal choices, do you prefer $10 today, $20 in a week? Okay, after that, they might answer, well, do you prefer $50 today or $70 in 2 months? And so it's always going to be between a smaller sooner amount and a larger later amount. That structure leads people to start creating shortcuts in their heads, heuristics, as it were. So once you sort of learn how to answer the question for this type of format, you can do it more quickly. Right? That's the benefit. But the downside is that you're not going through the full thought process anymore. It's not like that first question where you thought, hey, how would I make this choice? Let me think about the trade-offs. You eventually stop thinking about the trade-offs and you just apply this shortcut. And what you eventually start to get is, rather than, let's call it the real world decision-making process, where most of the time when you encounter a choice in the real world, you don't encounter it over. If you're trying to predict these real world choices, and those are fairly one of, and you ask repeated questions to try to get more data to better estimate people's preferences or individual differences, then you eventually end up getting something that's like an automated response. It's almost like you trained an AI to do this survey and you're now getting the AI responses. And funnily enough, maybe nowadays someone is training an AI to do their
Hmm.
surveys for them. But I don't want to cross that bridge for now. That's a nightmare for experimenters to think about.
Yeah, 100%. That is super good data for me to hear because we help people design quizzes, which are kind of like surveys. A lot of times you're gathering data and they always want to know how many questions to ask. And my answer is typically that you can ask a lot of questions as long as there's a lot of variation. And so what you're saying actually gives like real data to that, because it's like you're saying that, I think what I hear you saying is like if you have too many questions, they're all the same format, people just go into robot mode and they just answer all the same way. You don't
Yeah,
actually gather any new research about that person.
exactly. And so it sounds like you're already on top of things with what you're telling your clients. And people will try to ask me, like, so what is the right number of questions to ask? And that's going to differ depending on the different contexts. And in some contexts, you simply need to ask more. Some of my colleagues are telling me that they've been running into reviewers citing our paper and telling them, you can't have this many questions. And the crazy thing is, they're doing neuroscience research where they have to ask this many questions because your brain is, your head is only so stable in an fMRI machine. And so you need at least 50 data points in order to get the fidelity of signal. And our research, at least in the context that we studied, said like, well, 10 is kind of all you really need. And if you have more, you can actually get a decline. You can actually start to reduce the information you're getting. And so so imagine that you're getting like real responses for the first 5 questions or so. And then after that, it's you getting decreasing replies, and then maybe it peaks at 10 and just plateaus. At some point, you're getting more information from the heuristic process than you are from that first 10. And that's going to bring down the overall predictive validity. And so if your goal is indeed to understand real world, how people make real world behaviors, then you have to ask fewer questions because you just don't get this many opportunities to make a choice in the real world. But if your goal is to understand actual individual differences or the way a process works in the brain, you can ask more questions. There is simply trade-offs to be made.
Have you looked at it all? Like, because it sounds like that study was based on asking the same type of question over and over again, like, would you do this or that? Have you looked at whether or not that drop off resets if you start asking a different type of question? Like, okay, the first five are about, would you take $5 now or $10 later for the first five questions? And then after that, you start asking, like, if your friend did this and if your friend was being offered, right, like it changes the mindset. Have you looked at whether or not that resets it?
So we haven't looked at it, but we do recommend that as actually one of the primary ways to sort of break this heuristic process to change the format of the questions. And there are different ways you can ask the same type of question, right? So instead of asking $10 today is $20 tomorrow, you could say, well, imagine that I'm offering you $10 today now. How much would I have to pay you more tomorrow in order to make you wait for it? Right. And so that's going to get technically the same information, maybe even more information, and have a different format. And it'll keep people on their feet. And even just the idea of taking a break might also break up the heuristic process. Another thing is if I was trying to think about this in terms of quizzes, imagine that you have some quiz questions which are more important than others. You might be tempted to put those towards the end of the questionnaire because you feel like it will build up to this in some way. But if you're worried about even just losing attention, and by the way, that's not our process, right? It's not about people are making more mistakes or they're paying less and less attention. It's really about the heuristic process. But if you want to get the most important information and you don't want people to sort of be on autopilot while giving that information, put those questions more upfront. It may feel weird in terms of survey design, but it seems to be what our research would suggest.
No, that's a great suggestion because in the quiz use case, in the quiz land, what's going to be off if you don't get the accurate data is you're giving people an immediate reading at the end because there's logic on the back end. And it will show them like, oh, you answered this way, therefore I recommend this saving strategy for you. And if they're not giving real answers or if it's on autopilot, then you're going to give a misaccurate reading. So that's really helpful, I think, for people to hear because it is two things stand out to me. And I don't know if you have opinions on these. People do tend to want to put things towards the end that are the most important. And then also, they always want to ask fewer questions. That it stood out to me because you made that little note about like, oh, other researchers read this paper and then they use it as a reason to ask fewer questions. In all my experience, everybody always wants to bias towards, I want to ask less questions. Do you have any idea why?
That I haven't thought too much about. As academics, we have exactly the opposite experience where we want to
Mm.
ask more questions. There's always one more thing that you think, I'm curious about this. What if we also just tack this on to the end? And I'm certainly guilty of this myself. My surveys, in addition to whatever is the main dependent variable that we're measuring, I always just throw in some individual different skills just because I think, well, what if it's different depending on if you're an extrovert or introvert? Or what if it's different between Republicans and Democrats? Right? There's a lot of strong individual differences out there. And I think one of the problems in academic research is that people try to narrow down their view of human behavior, human decision making as very unitary, as this is something that's true about human psychology, but it's never true for everyone. It's never true for everyone. And so you kind of are taught to avoid the nuance because it confuses the story. And because things like, say, gender, right? Gender could have a huge effect, but you end up not being able to manipulate gender. And so you don't have the causality. You don't know if it's gender or if it's something correlated with gender. And I've completely stopped answering your questions. So I apologize for that. But so let me try to get back to your question a little. If your users want to go for shorter quizzes, maybe part of it is just they're more cognizant of the fact that people's attention spans are limited. These are businesses and they understand that keeping someone's attention, unless it's like like which Harry Potter house do you belong to? These are maybe more boring questions that people don't want to respond to forever. I'm sure there is research out there suggesting in terms of keeping someone on a platform to keep the questions shorter as well. But I think that has very different reasoning behind it.
Yeah, I think the antidote, though, is like kind of similar to some of the other research that you've done around like immediacy and time. Like, if you can frame things in a way where it's like, by answering these questions, you can solve a problem that you have, or you can reach a goal that you have in a more immediate time frame, then you can ask questions and people will answer it because there's a reason why, like they're going to get something in the shorter term. But what you said about kind of the difficulty of pinpointing one, all humans are this way, all humans are that way, is really interesting to me because I think that that's come up more and more in my research recently as I try to think about like what are the best practices for quiz design. And where I've kind of landed is that it is different. Like it depends on what topic you're talking about. It depends on who you're selling to or who's using these things. Where's your head at in terms of like what is a good academic or a good way to approach the fact that there are different tranches of people in terms of how they act?
Well, like I said, I don't think that academics tend to focus on these issues, at least not the ones that I talk to. But in this era of big data, I think it's very possible to do micro targeting. The perhaps like slightly different version of the question that you asked is how do we think about what are the characteristics that are most important? Because it's very possible with as much data as we have about people out there to overfit and to target in a way that perhaps is kind of meaningless. And it's going to depend on the context, of course. If it's trying to predict the way that someone's going to vote, maybe a lot of different things are going to matter. But if it comes down to understanding the way that people are going to purchase something, I think the number of variables that matter is probably a lot less. Even
Hmm.
though I started this topic by saying people are not all the same, at the same time, the things that make people different don't have as much influence on their behaviors as perhaps people themselves will tend to think, right? We're taught everyone's a unique snowflake. We are all different and special in our own ways. But in fact, the whole field of social psychology evolved to show that, in fact, the situation and the context and the way that information is provided actually has a huge impact on people's decisions, on people's judgments. And as a result, you end up kind of de-emphasizing the importance of the individual. So
Hmm.
really kind of counterbalancing forces. And I didn't answer your question, but I hope that provides some insight.
No, it does provide insight because it kind of zooms it out a little bit of like what does actually matter from what the research shows. And it kind of sounds like what you're saying, if I'm hearing it correctly, is like within certain realms, there's not as much variability. Like if you're just focusing on decision making around purchases, and then if you were to zoom that down even to like decision making of purchases of skincare products, like then there's less variability in how people make decisions.
I think I'm not sure I want to say that. I think the point that I was really trying to push on is that when it comes to the design of, say, how your website should look to sell to this specific person, yes, those individual differences are going to matter. However, I think there's a lot more design factors that work across different types of people that is the sort of thing that researchers, and I want to say probably traditional market research also tend to focus on. But again, with so much data being available and much more powerful processing, and now with AI, and perhaps even more ability to micro target and micromanage even the look of a website, I think there are more opportunities, but that's a lot of work for future research.
Yeah, it's a ton of work. Yeah, but it's also kind of encouraging in a way because you can learn from lots of different types of people. It doesn't have to just be like, oh, you can only learn from people that are doing literally the same thing you're doing, selling to the same exact people you're selling to. You can learn from somebody that's in a totally different industry. There's a lot of overlap. Where is your curiosity taking you next? I know you've done a lot with time and decision making. Is it still there? Is there a new kind of area that you're looking at? Like what's got your curiosity now?
I will admit that I'm a bit of intellectual. I was going to use a bad word. I'm curious about many things, and that curiosity, it turns out, is very entertaining to have, but not the best actually for academics because, as at least an early career academic, you're sort of taught. Well, you really have to create a lot of expertise in one area. And if every one of my papers studies something totally different, it becomes very hard to write in all of these different areas because I'm learning a new literature for everything. That said, post tenure, the decision I made was I want to be on top of the latest research trends on AI. I'm endlessly fascinated with AI and technology, and I've tried very hard to shift my research in that direction. I have a lot of new projects on that, but the one that I'm perhaps most excited to talk about is the idea of working with AI. It's something that I do. In preparing for this interview, I actually used AI to help me think of how I could be smart, funny, and humble at the same time in responding to you. And I didn't use those responses, but having them queued up gave me the confidence to go into this and feel like I'm well prepared, even if Josh asks me something very out of left field. Now, the research that I specifically looked at is do people understand how to use AI in terms of using it as a complement to your abilities and not as a substitute? And what we realize is that something about complementarity, this idea that people have different strengths and weaknesses, or you might have different strengths and weaknesses as an AI system, is that it's actually very hard for people to realize that complementarity can be beneficial. Now, in some domains, it's probably the case that it's reasonable. So let's say that you're working on a project where you need both someone who's good at presentation and someone who's really good at data analysis. Well, you know that if you're the presentation person, you need to find the person who has the quantitative skills to back you up. But when it comes to doing a task where everyone's kind of working on the same thing, then the things that you're weak at and someone else is strong at, you'll tend to not fully understand how come they're good at this. So I'll give you an example from our actual research studies where we look at doing image recognition. Now, it turns out AI and just machine learning algorithms tend to process images very differently than humans do. So if that's the case, then when you recognize a photo and the AI doesn't, the machine learning algorithm doesn't, you think to yourself, well, that's weird. It doesn't seem to be doing a very good job. It's so obvious that this is an image of a dog. But when the AI is able to understand what this basically bunch of static is on the page is actually a sailboat, that seems mysterious to you. You don't understand that process. And so even if we don't bother telling people that this is an AI or that this is a human, people will tend to choose to work with people who are more similar to them in terms of their skill set. And this is not even talking about I just like people who are like me. This is really looking at collaboration in the purest sense of I'm just getting someone's work output and understanding what they said, and then I'm going to make the final decision. And so we coined this term complementarity neglect to say that when it comes to choosing who to work with, we have a serious problem with making choices about working with a partner that will be most beneficial to us, exactly because we don't understand what makes them beneficial. We don't understand their skill sets. And in the real world, it gets even more complicated because it might also be threatening to work with someone who has different skills than you, right? And the culture might be different. They might just be a very different person.
Yeah. Well, that's like that's I mean, I'm just thinking in my head, I'm like, well, yeah, like you look at the boards of companies, right? This
They're
is
all
exactly
they're
what you
all the
said.
same.
Right, they're all exactly the same. And like but right, you're missing a bunch of skills as a result. You're missing a bunch of perspectives as a result. And like somebody that did embrace complementarity would go so much further. So it's really fascinating that that's coming up again with AI. Not surprising at all, but fascinating because it's just like, okay, well, if people do this in their companies, of course they're going to do it when they're working with an AI bot. So that's just like super interesting. So then what did you find in terms of like what is best in how to work with an AI?
Well, so I can tell you what doesn't work. If you just assign someone to work with someone who's complementary to them, so again, AI or not,
Mm-hmm.
you end up running into perhaps a predictable dilemma, which is, well, because I don't understand them, I also don't trust their work output. And so I sort of ignore even when they have the right answer because I don't understand where they got that right answer. So that doesn't work. You can't just force people to be in a complementary team. However, things that do work at least a little bit include things like just suggesting, well, consider the a way that this partner could help you. Which of these partners could potentially help you more? And also, by the way, here is a table showing all of your performances and all of their performances. It's not that people can't see complementarity. It's just not the first thing that they think of. They tend to focus on their perceived competence instead. And someone who has different skills than you doesn't feel competent. It doesn't feel like they're good at the job that you're both tasked with because they're bad whenever you're good. And that makes it feel like, wow, they must be doing something very wrong. Maybe they're not paying attention. Maybe there's something wrong with how they see the world.
Yeah, because that kind of goes back to what we talked about at the very beginning of like the confirmation bias thing of like, this is how I see the world. And that kind of sounds the same as what you're saying now. Like, well, I'm good at these things, therefore these things are important. I'm not good at these things, therefore they're less important because that's not my skill set. That's like, I don't know, I just think that's super interesting what you said, like about how we perceive the value as lower if it's not what we are personally good at. And it's hard for us to actually work with somebody that has complementary skill sets, even though that's like, that would be the best way to solve the problem. That'd be the best way to actually achieve the goal. So you're saying then that, like, if you provide data or like reassurance that, like, here's what I'm good at, here's what you're good at, here's what we could do together, then that helps people?
Yeah, it helps people, but not all the way. I think for some people, it's just very hard to wrap your mind around this idea of, even though this person seems to suck at a lot of stuff that's very easy, that's not important. We tend to focus on this negative, right? We have this negativity bias in how we take in information. And so we focus on all the times that they fail, and we tend to focus less on the times that someone can be beneficial to us. And that's a broader case as well, because the failures are more risky. The failures make it seem like there's something potentially problematic. And so it makes sense evolutionary to focus on the negative. But in this case, it really hurts the overall process.
Right. But we're not in like a realm or a world anymore where the AI failing to give you the right answer means that the lion's gonna get you, right? Like, so it's, I wonder if that's like a maladaptive like response.
It is, and I think when it comes to working with AI, and again, in our studies, we're really focused on a very specific type of AI that's very limited compared to what we have now. I think we really do have to start thinking about what are the skills that we have to develop as humans in order to be complementary with the AI, because the AI actually is increasingly getting good at pretty much everything. And so where do we still fit in? What are the skill sets that we uniquely bring in? And a scary thought is, what if there really isn't anything? Is there room for us in the work world anymore? I was thinking about, like, like we always think of, like, well, humans are intuitively, like, we're very empathic, we're good at emotions, right? That's a human trait. But the research shows that AI is actually more empathetic than humans, at least in terms of the perceived empathy, right? They're able to provide more empathetic responses than humans on average. And so if they're even better at this very human thing, what is the space for which we can work? It's a $1 million question. It's the thing that's keeping all the AI skeptics up at night, and it's the sort of thing that I hope will give me lots of room to research in the future.
I mean, I'm sure there will. Like, I'm sure you've done research on it already, but the dichotomy that we're already seeing, because we have a lot of customers that do split test our quizzes against AI. Like, okay, could I release an AI chatbot that solves the same problem that the quiz solves? Let's say it's like helping you find a workout plan. I could release an AI chatbot that does that, or I could release a quiz that does that. And the difference that we're finding is that while the AI is better on average, let's say it's the one quartile above the mean, right? Like it's 75% accurate. What people absolutely disdain about that is the fact that it's not 100. And so where the like very specific human win is like knowing exactly what the audience needs and then giving them exactly that, even though the data would tell you like, oh well, the AI is better on average. So that's been super fascinating to me, and it kind of dovetails to what you're talking about. It's like, where do the humans still fit in? And like, so far, and maybe the AI could get there, but then the problem that I can never work out in my head is like, how is the AI going to get that knowledge of the other humans who are the customers of this company? Like, I don't know how you would. You'd have to like build relationships with them over time, years, maybe decades, because that's what the human business owner has, that can then say, I've seen somebody that's like exactly the same as you and had the same background as you. You pick up all the subtle cues that don't even show up. They just start like in the background. And then you're like, oh yeah, you're really gonna like going to spin class on Tuesdays and hot yoga on Thursdays, and like the person is just like, oh my gosh, you know me. And
Yeah.
like, I don't I just maybe you'll figure
I
it
like
out.
that a lot, and it actually I don't mean to bring in my other research, but it turns out to be a perfect dovetail with my research on aging and decision making,
Hmm.
where we think about when so this is in the realm of getting older, and when you get older, your brain changes in a way that, on average, your ability to process new information slows down. And the thing that helps older adults not become worse decision makers, at least on average, is the fact that they have this increased experience. Now, it's very hard to quantify that experience, that knowledge, but at least academics will refer to it overall as crystallized intelligence as opposed to fluid intelligence. Right. So you can think of fluid intelligence as the CPU. This is how fast your brain can process. But the crystallized intelligence is kind of like your, maybe not memory, but your software. Like your software is getting better and better. You have a bigger and bigger database of, for example, past clients that you've worked with that you can draw on, which the AI wouldn't have access to. And so in many ways, you're giving me an idea for future research where, in terms of like bringing together complementarity and these different ways of doing decision making or contributing to a job role, you have different abilities, and maybe the AI will just be better than you at many things that require fluid intelligence. But your knowledge, your connections and relationships with people, that is something that you will always have a unique advantage on, at least for now, right? We never know where AI will eventually go with this.
Right. Yeah, that's what I was thinking in the back of my head is like, I wonder if you will be able to build an AI system that does have crystallized intelligence over time. But that would be a fascinating study to like see where it is head to head and like see how that actually shows up, I guess, in like a fMRI scan or something like of, somebody's talking to the chat bot and then somebody's talking to like a person with crystallized intelligence in a specific space and see how that actually feels for the client or for the person who's having that conversation. Like, do they actually feel connected or feel like they're being empathized with better by somebody that has the crystallized intelligence, even if they don't have as good of fluid intelligence? So interesting. Well, that's cool. I'm glad you're getting into that. I think it's there's going to be so much more fun stuff. So I'll have to follow along as that research comes out. Speaking of that, and we got to get wrapped here, but where can people go to follow along with research as it comes out from you and your past research that you've done, like read all the papers?
I actually don't have a public repository. I guess this is usually this space where people plug their socials, but I
Yeah.
guess if you just do a Google Scholar search for me, there are actually at least a dozen Geelys out there, but I'm the only one who does decision making research. So hopefully it shouldn't be too hard to find.
Perfect. Yeah, yeah. And I highly recommend for anybody listening. I've read a few of them and super, super, super interesting stuff that's come out in these studies. So definitely go check that out. Well, thank you for this conversation. This was really enlightening. And I'm sure people listening, as they're thinking about, all aspects of question asking and decision making and time, like we'll get a lot from this. So really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Josh, for having me. This was such a fun conversation, and it's really given me stuff to think about too. So thank you for enlightening me as well.
That's awesome. I'm glad. All right. Thank you.
Take care.